So now let's take a look further south in the southern colonies and see how they were developing prior to the American Revolution. Southern colonies had a lot of fertile land, and they had the milder climate in the southeast, which were perfect for growing cash crops, which are crops grown for sale rather than for use by farmers. So different than what was happening in New England with the subsistence farmers, right? We know that this was also why Native Americans lived in that area. They liked those shorter or the longer growing seasons, the nice climate, and of course the land's fertile. They used, on these plantations, they grew tobacco, rice, and indigo, which is a plant that produces blue dye for cloth. A lot of times cotton is associated with plantation farming, but it won't become a major crop until after the American Revolution into the early 1800s. Tobacco particularly thrived in the hot, humid growing seasons of Virginia and coastal Maryland. Rice grew well in the swampy lowlands of the Carolinas, but again, colonists had no experience with rice cultivation. That doesn't grow in Europe. So they depended heavily on enslaved Africans who had experience on rice plantations in the West Indies to be able to grow and harvest rice. Many of the plantations were built along rivers to make it easy to water the rice fields and ship products. And there was really little need for port cities when you have an abundance of water. The exception, though, is Charlestown, which eventually becomes Charleston. Many plantation owners lived there during part of the year when they were escaping the swampy, mosquito-infested lands where they grew their products. Charleston ends up growing to be the fourth largest colonial city. It never grew larger because English and New England shippers controlled trade and didn't allow a lot of trade down there, and also it lacked that strong merchant class like what we saw in New England colonies. Planters initially had hired indentured servants, right? Those people who agreed to work for a specified amount of time, usually for their passage to come to the colonies. But in 1698, England allowed all of its merchants to begin engaging in slave trade, okay? And so the labor force begins to turn to enslaved Africans. In 1619, when the first enslaved Africans are brought here and brought to Jamestown, they're actually brought here illegally. They are stolen from a Spanish slave ship because the British didn't allow merchants to participate in slave trade. But after 1698, when England begins allowing them to, we see that the population drastically increases. So in 1660, so this is before they're allowed to engage in the slave trade, about 900 enslaved Africans lived in the Chesapeake area, which is that Maryland, Virginia area. By 1720, they accounted for about a fifth of the population. Jump ahead 50 years, that's closer to a third or a half. In 1750, 40% of Virginia's population is enslaved, and more than half of South Carolina's is enslaved. And of the African Americans living in the United States at the time, 90% are enslaved. There are free Africans, both in the North and the South, but the overwhelming majority are enslaved. So go ahead, take a minute, pause the video, answer the question, why were tobacco and rice good cash crops for Virginia, Maryland, and the Carolinas? So wealthy planters bought more and more land and enslaved people, and so they bought more and more people as well. They produced more and more tobacco, rice, and indigo. And the owners are reaping the benefits. It's easy to make a lot of wealth when you're not paying your workers. But not all farmers became wealthy, and so these distinct classes started to form among southern farmers. The rich landowners lived like the nobles of Europe. They didn't actually work on their plantations, right? They had enslaved people do that. And the other thing is that these smaller farmers actually really end up being anti-slavery because they can't compete with these plantations that can buy these enslaved people to work their land and not have to pay them. Types of work that enslaved people did depended on where they lived, so it could vary. In South Carolina, for example, a lot of times they were given just like a to-do list, essentially, and complete each of those things a day. So whenever they were done, they were done. In the Chesapeake area, most worked a specific amount of hours or until an overseer or a supervisor told them to stop. Some plantations owners treated their enslaved people fairly well, others didn't. A lot of them had terrible workload, which took its toll. Death rates among the enslaved surged. Now, one thing I will say, okay, while we're even saying that plantation owners treated enslaved people fairly well, remember they're still enslaved. Okay, I don't think any of us would appreciate being enslaved, no matter how nicely we were treated. Not be able to decide where you go, when you go, where you live, who you love, whether or not you're going to have a child or not. I don't think any of us would see any kind of fair treatment in that. Now, in the backcountry, which is the western part of the southern colonies, just east of the Appalachian Mountains, just over the mountains, is what we refer to as the back company. It had rich soil, rolling hills, deep forests of Piedmont, which is a relatively flat area between the Appalachian Mountains and the coastal plain. In the early 1700s, settlers began settling and forming farms in that area, which is actually against the law. They're not really allowed to do this. They just kind of do it. And it causes a lot of issues with the Native Americans, who are obviously still living there. Many of these colonists that moved there are Scots-Irish, people who had immigrated from the northern part of Ireland. These people learned to be self-sufficient because you weren't close to any major city center. You weren't close to the rest of the colonists. Women oftentimes saw a lot of equality working alongside men to ensure their survival and ensure their success. And these people definitely did not depend on the enslaved to farm. Go ahead and pause. What was the social structure like in the Chesapeake area in the 1700s? So now let's talk a little bit about the living conditions for the enslaved people that worked on these plantations. Many times men and women spent hours in the field. Sometimes overseers used whips and other brutal tactics to make enslaved people work harder. Sometimes enslavers had other slaves, called drivers, push their fellow enslaved workers. Those that worked in the household often saw less brutality. Men and women cooked and did other domestic jobs. Like, for instance, George Washington had his valet. That's his enslaved individual who helped him dress every morning and get ready and those kinds of things. Many men became artisans, or people that had skills at making things by hand, such as furniture or clothing. Women were nurses, weavers, and nannies. Marriage between enslaved men and women was illegal. They had to get an enslaver's permission to live together as husband and wife if they wanted to. A lot of these marriages were torn apart when a spouse was sold. Many would also walk long distances at night to visit family members that had been sold to other plantations. Often these enslaved people would build their own houses. Typically they were one-room cabins. Planters provided only the basic necessities, so often they planted their own gardens as well. They also raised hogs and chickens and hunted and fished for extra food. I think one of the most interesting stories about the slave tradition of marriage, because you couldn't legally get married, was they would do a ceremony called jumping the broom. So they would lay a broom on the ground, and once you said "I do," and the ceremony ended, then they would jump together over the broom, and that was a symbol that they were now united in marriage. Many enslaved people were from different parts of West Africa, and they had different cultures and languages, but they were just kind of thrown together. And so they began to blend those native languages with English. And Africans also had a huge influence on colonial culture, especially music. Okay, jazz and the blues is going to come out of these African spirituals and the slave songs. They also introduced clay pottery, certain types of basket weaving. They brought new musical instruments, and they also brought new foods such as okra, melons, and bananas with them. Sorry, bananas is spelled wrong. In Boston, an enslaved man taught his owner the practice of vaccinations, which ends up protecting the city from a smallpox outbreak. However, again, you're enslaved. So they did what they could to deal with their situation. So many actively rebelled. They staged slowdowns, which meant they worked slower than they probably could. They would fake illnesses. They would secretly destroy crops and tools. Some of them would self-emancipate, which means running away. And some even became violent. An example of that is this. In 1739, the Stono Rebellion occurred. There were 50 enslaved people who revolted near Stono River, South Carolina. It was led by a literate slave named Jemmy, or Cato, and armed planters defeated these enslaved people, and the enslaved rebels started to head to St. Augustine, Florida, which was under Spanish control. And the Spanish government had promised them freedom. The South Carolina militia pursued, and they killed anyone suspected of being involved. Other revolts had happened, but this one scared the colonists most. So in response to the Stonewall Rebellion, the South Carolina legislature enacted some harsh slave codes. All enslaved people and their children were now permanently enslaved. There was no more emancipation at a certain age, etc., etc. They also prohibited enslaved people from learning to read and write. So go ahead and pause the video and answer these two questions. What are some of the ways in which enslaved people asserted their humanity and kept their traditions alive? And 2, what were the long-term negative consequences of the Stonewall Rebellion on enslaved people?